Breaking Bad ran for 5 seasons over the span of 6 years. It was nominated for 58 Emmys, winning 16 of them. It is regarded by many as the greatest TV show of all time. It spawned a movie and a spin-off TV show, of which the latter has enjoyed similar success to its predecessor. But at one point, Breaking Bad started off where all TV shows start, in the early awkward phases of creation where everything was still up in the air. This is what Breaking Bad almost was, what it could have been, and the origins of how it came to be. Before Breaking Bad, showrunner Vince Gilligan was best known for his time as a writer on the TV series The X-Files. This show aired from 1993 to 2002, and when it ended, Vince had a hard time finding work. 3 years on from the end of The X-Files, he found himself jobless and running out of hope that he would be able to get back into the writing business, joking that he would end up being a sales associate somewhere or would end up digging ditches. He shared this sentiment with friend and fellow X-Files writer Tom Schnauz, who was also jobless. One night, the two were bemoaning their current working status, and that's when Tom made a joke based on a recent New York Times article he had read.
And then he said, what about if we just buy an RV, pool our resources, buy an RV and put a meth lab in the back?
The idea immediately stuck to Vince, and he couldn't stop thinking about it. For him, it was one simple question that made the idea so intriguing. What would make someone do this? What would make a regular, everyday man such as himself turn to a crime as extreme as cooking meth? Vince stated that it was a rare eureka moment for him, and his passion for the idea was intense and immediate.
By the time the phone call was over, that moment of inspiration had led to, I didn't have a name for him yet, but led to that character who would eventually be known as Walter White.
At the time, Vince was closing in on his 40th birthday, and he admitted his own little midlife crisis may have contributed to the idea of Breaking Bad. The idea was a good start, but he knew the character of Walter White needed to be something more. He needed someone that changed drastically, from good to evil over the course of the show. Vince explained how, historically, TV shows stay in a state of stasis, where the characters never really change for the sake of comfort and longevity.
TV shows exist in a kind of a stasis world. It's helpful for the characters to not change, because if they were to change, you don't have that comfort of inviting them into your room week upon week. And what really excited me was the idea of going against that grain.
Because of the change he planned on Walter White's character having, it meant the show would be finite and wouldn't be able to go on for a long time, which is exactly what Vince wanted. But where did the name Breaking Bad come from? Vince, who is from Virginia, explained that the term is a southern regionalism, and just assumed everyone knew what it meant.
It means to raise hell.
But he quickly learned the opposite was true. The head of Sony had no idea what it meant, and even asked Vince,
"Can't you think of a better title?"
All the confusion surrounding the name didn't fluster Vince, and he stuck with it. We can't imagine what the show would have been called otherwise. So now, Vince had the name and the idea. A crazy idea that went against the grain of television, wherein an average guy starts cooking meth and becomes a despicable person. Selling this idea was going to be no easy task.
I did not think that I would have much of a chance of selling this story.
About a year and a half before Breaking Bad would come to be, Vince had a deal with Sony TV to do a pilot for another show, but it was scrapped right before pre-production started. During this time, Vince had gotten to know the two guys that ran Sony TV, Zach Van Amberg and Jamie Ehrlicht, and they told Vince if he had any other ideas to come to them, which is exactly what he did with Breaking Bad. When he pitched the show to them, he said they had a look in their eyes of what the hell, and he went home thinking that he had just wasted his time. But the next day he got a call from them, and they said it was a crazy idea, but that they were into it, and were on board with helping him sell the idea to a network. And so began the pitching to a bunch of TV networks. Vince had a ton of passion for Breaking Bad, but selling such an insane sounding idea was a large hill to climb. He pitched to TNT, which he says was the single best meeting he ever had. The executives were into it and listening to every word. They reacted positively to everything Vince was saying. But at the end of the meeting, they looked at each other and said,
"Oh God, I wish we could buy this." if we bought this, we'd be fired.
They asked if Walt could be a counterfeiter instead of a meth dealer, but that was obviously a no-go for Vince. He followed up this great meeting with another pitch the next day at HBO, which he said was the worst meeting of his career.
The woman we're pitching to could not have been less interested, not even in my story, but about whether I actually lived or died.
Eventually, he met with FX, who ended up buying the show. But after thinking about it for a while, they also passed, and allowed AMC to come in and purchase it instead. That may seem simple enough, but Vince stated it was very rare behavior for FX to allow AMC to come in and take the show. And he was, and still is, extremely grateful for how FX handled the situation.
Most networks, the way they see it, we paid a pittance for the script. We're just going to leave it in a file cabinet somewhere. We're not going to risk letting it go to another company and risk the 1,000 to 1 or 10,000 to 1 or million to 1 chance that this script that we passed on becomes a hit for someone else. That's the way most folks do business.
Now that they had a network for the show, they needed to start the very important process of casting, and their first priority was finding the right actor to portray Walter White.
We're going to take Mr. Chips and we're going to turn him into Scarface.
Vince knew he needed the perfect actor. Someone you could empathize with, even after all the horrible things he does. He immediately thought of Bryan Cranston due to their time together on The X-Files. Cranston's character on The X-Files was, simply put, not a nice person. He was racist, bitter, and rude. But Bryan played him in such a way that you still felt for him when he met his ultimate demise at the end of the episode. It was the perfect mix of evil and sympathy that fit the character of Walter White.
Let's launch ourselves on the right foot by hiring an actor who will remain likable long past the point of good sense. Bryan Cranston has that ability to remain empathizable.
While Vince was convinced that Cranston was the man, the studio wasn't. It took some convincing and a lot of stubbornness from Vince, but the studio eventually agreed to the casting choice and gave Cranston the role without even auditioning him. As for Cranston's perspective on the process, he immediately knew he wanted the part after reading the pilot.
You knew immediately you wanted to play this part.
I knew immediately. Yeah. It was that good.
However, Cranston would have never had the opportunity if it wasn't for some retrospectively fortunate timing. Malcolm in the Middle would have been shooting their next season at the same time as Breaking Bad, but was canceled. Cranston then fortunately passed on another show at Fox, leaving the door open for his casting as Walter White.
What was initially bad news, it was like, no, that wasn't for us. That wasn't for me, so just cruise on.
Cranston wasn't the only X-Files alum to land a part on Breaking Bad. Aaron Paul also starred on the show, which excited Vince. Vince was very warm towards Aaron and helpful throughout the audition process, which was a huge help to Aaron, since he was at the lowest point of his career at the time.
Well, when I read the pilot, I had been fighting at this business for 10 years.
Isn't that funny?
Ups and downs. I didn't know where my next check was gonna come in and how I was gonna pay my bills.
This may be why his first audition didn't go all too well, as he forgot some of his lines and apologized for the blunder mid-audition.
It's like, damn it, Giant's sick of his ass, wasn't it?
All of a sudden, age 50?
Yeah,
He thought that was the end of things, but casting brought him back in for another reading. Before the second audition, Vince pulled Aaron aside to have a one-on-one with him and to give him some advice and help loosen him up.
It felt like Vince was already in my corner before I even started.
Aaron didn't hear anything for 2 weeks because he later learned that no one wanted him for the part. No one except Vince, that was, who eventually convinced the executives to go with Aaron. And we can now safely say that was the right decision.
He made it happen,
Right.
thank God.
Dean Norris is yet another cast member that you can catch on The X-Files. Vince Gilligan remembered him from a specific 1995 episode where Norris played a U.S. Marshal. In fact, Dean Norris has had a bunch of roles where he plays a cop, both in film and TV. When Norris auditioned for the role of Hank Schrader, he thought the show was a comedy.
I was like conflicted. I was like, this is funny to me.
Are we sure it isn't Hank Schrader that's playing Dean Norris?
Yo, Heisenberg, pull out my gat, bop, bop. Who's Heisenberg now, bitch?
Anna Gunn wasn't on the X-Files, but she easily had the most unique and awkward audition. Her audition scene was the same one from the pilot, where her character pleasures Walter. Gunn had just met Bryan Cranston 15 minutes before reading with him, but that didn't stop her from performing the action on the arm of the chair that was between her and Cranston. What a way to meet your co-star.
So I reached over to the arm and pleasured the arm.
After all the characters were cast, the only thing left to do was to film the pilot episode, let it air, and wait for the results. While the episode was well received by critics and audiences, it didn't go well in the ratings. At all. Vince Gilligan recalled that it had under 1 million viewers, but The Hollywood Reporter stated it had a viewership of 1.41 million. Either way, not good numbers, in part due to a big NFL game that was airing at the same time. Regardless, there was enough there for AMC to pick up the show for a full season. And well, you know the rest.
Maybe you and I could partner up.
This is not meth.
Hellfire rain down on my house!
I am the one who knocks.
Yeah, bitch! Magnets!
Say my name. Heisenberg. You're goddamn right.